Alright, time for another DraftPhysics.com, DebatePhysics.com, also video presentation. So continuing with the Professor Dave Explains videos, doing classic physics is what they call it, but it's just the elemental mechanical part of physics without all the extraordinary woo of quantum mechanics. So and bent space and all the all the warpy twerpy stuff. Okay, basic physics. So I could make an argument, maybe I'll make it now, that the universe runs a certain way. So there's different ways to look at something very elemental. So I can make the argument that it's a push-averse. Okay, that everything has to be pushed. There's no such thing as a real pull. It's not elemental. There's no concept for an elemental pull when there's lots of easy conceptual diagrams for a push, for banging into something. Then the only question becomes, do you bang into it and stick to it? That is, you continue to push it like a Sisyphus pushing a boulder, or can you just push it, roll it? Somehow you stop moving, it moves. Now, I would argue that the force doesn't act that way. It doesn't bang into things and then disappear, and the thing moves. The force is stuck to the thing. It's pushing it slower than it would go if it wasn't pushing it. It's just momentum. It really is just bumping particles. And the fact is the particles can stick or reflect. Okay. So the simple argument is if matter's moving in the direction of force is moving, then the force can stick to it. If it's not moving in the direction of force is moving, it can't. And it must reflect. So if you wanted to evacuate all the force from some area, you'd have to do it by having the force stick to matter and continue moving away at a very high speed. So it's pretty much impossible to get rid of the force, and if you understand that the force is causing the motion in the matter, then you can understand that it's pretty much impossible to get matter to stop moving altogether. Electrons and protons specifically, they're doing all the motion. So that's another assertion, is that I would argue there's only one universe, okay, and it has discrete quanta of energy in it, moving the speed of light, and electrons and protons, and that's it. So there's two kinds of matter, there's two kinds of force, electron force, proton force, and there's just an interaction in that universe between those objects, and there's no woo to it. There's no fields that aren't made out of real things. So everything is something, there is no nothings. And nothing certainly doesn't do anything, in the real universe, and nothing can't do anything. And it's all based on the fact that the force has the momentum and it can share it with matter. And force can't interact with force, so it must, if anything is to happen, if anything is to change in the universe, there really has to be matter for the force to interact with and be altered by. Alright, maybe that's enough. Maybe I don't got a drawing of it. Okay. So these, unfortunately, these next couple of videos are pretty boring, but they're short. So that's the only good thing to say. And I'll see if there's anything that triggers me, but I mean, it's all pretty basic stuff in terms of just understanding, in this case, that the real temperature scale doesn't have anything called a negative degrees. Okay, the idea of a negative temperature is idiotic, and frankly, what needs to be understood is it's really just a scale from no motion to positive motion in some direction. Motion versus no motion, and no motion in a universe full of force isn't very practical. You're going to jitter at minimum, and that motion is what we call heat, and the heat really is just a manifestation of the force. So every place in the universe is hot in reality. It's just that it's not as hot as us. So we can sit there and pretend, okay, that it's cold, but it really isn't. It's a positive temperature, positive motion. It's just not as hot as us, right? And so we think it's some kind of opposite thing when no, it's not. It's not in some negative condition. It's in a clearly positive motion condition. It's just moving a lot slower than we are, jittering slowly. Yeah, it's probably enough.
We've gone through 3 of the laws of thermodynamics.
So he does this summing up thing, which is a 3-minute video. You should get to the subject. You shouldn't talk about the previous subjects, but whatever.
Which leaves just 1 to go. And the 3rd law of thermodynamics deals with another strange concept, the idea of a temperature of absolute 0. We know.
So why would that be strange or weird? And again, who are these videos for? I mean, 1 minute they're for college students, the next minute they're for 5-year-olds. I mean, what's the point?
Know that temperatures can get very hot and very cold, but not everyone is familiar with the idea of the coldest possible temperature.
So again, it's just the least possible motion. So the temperature is defined by motion. That's the force, that's the heat. The heat really is energy. It's nothing, it's not some other thing. So all motion is energy, and it doesn't matter whether it's back and forth or going somewhere. It's all energy.
However, with our new
it's all heat. So anytime you put anything into like a laser beam, the laser beam is just showing you what heat looks like when it's going in one direction. When force is going in one direction, that's what it looks like. And that's all.
Understanding of heat and temperature, it should make perfect sense. We know that temperature is a measure of available heat energy.
So again, available heat energy. What does the available part have to do with it? That doesn't mean a damn thing. It has a temperature regardless of availability, whatever the hell that could mean. And the temperature merely is a reflection of the fact that its electrons and protons are in motion.
Which is just a collection of kinetic energies of motion.
So obviously there's no kinetic energy, there's just momentum. So it's just a collection of its momentum. The total momentum is the total heat. The total mass moving. So if you take all the little motions and just calculate them into being one linear motion, you could calculate that into being a velocity, and you could just recognize you have this much mass moving this much velocity, therefore you have this much energy. It's always right. Okay, nature can't finagle momentum. Quoting Professor Lewin.
We know that as the temperature decreases, the internal energy of a system decreases.
So that's the internal energy is being described as the actual motion of objects, but I mean it's really just, again, the vibration of electrons and protons are what mostly cause that motion. Atoms don't move away from each other until their electrons and protons require it. So again, it happens in the electron and proton universe first. Everything that happens, all motion, all movement, all events that we would call an event, have to happen because electrons and protons say it happens.
As does the kinetic energy of each particle.
All the cause and effect is in that universe because, frankly, it's the only real universe. It's the elemental universe. Elemental, do you understand? It's the fundamental universe.
As the temperature becomes
the actual checkers, the actual pixels are the electrons and protons. The images the pixels can make, that's atoms and compounds and all this other stuff. So the emergent, which you can create as an emergent effect out of the electrons and protons, but and we're really distant from that universe, 10 to the 41 kind of huge difference in our size comparison. Apple to the Earth, versus, the quantum to the apple, gigantic number. So we're really far from being connected to that universe directly.
very cold, particles slow to a complete stop, and there is no more.
So particles, whatever that means, I mean, obviously the atoms aren't particles. So you have to understand the atoms are made out of individual electrons and protons, and they're the things doing all of the moving first.
Kinetic energy. No more kinetic energy of motion means no more temperature by.
So obviously if you can get rid of all the motion, the forces between them, they would have no charge, so to speak, because charge is being created by the interaction of the electrons and protons within the field of energy moving the speed of light. So it's obviously not going to be very probable that you can reduce or eliminate that, because then the whole atom just falls apart.
Any real definition of the term. So we will call this absolute zero. At absolute zero, every substance would.
So we know it doesn't happen. We know there's no such thing. We know you can't. Absolute zero is, again, no force of being applied to anything. And that's just an impossible theoretical position for things to be in, because they would separate out of that space. So the idea that you can create enough. This is like saying you could put a bunch of matter, okay, and then make the matter bigger and bigger, like it has a sphere, a hollow sphere. And if you could somehow make it bigger and bigger and bigger, all of the motion out would consume all of the force eventually. Okay, but we can't do that because, yeah, the matter will fall apart. The sphere can't withstand the vacuum created, so it ain't going to happen.
Be a solid, even things like hydrogen and helium. And one way of summarizing the third law of thermodynamics is by saying that the entropy of any crystalline substance at absolute zero will be equal to zero.
So again, this entropy argument, when entropy, by their own definition, is merely a state of, you could say, the smallest volume, or a state of the greatest quiet. And you could create that state, probably with lots of different ways of arranging electrons and protons. It's not just one way to do it. So they're implying that there's only one way to do it. And of course, there could be lots of ways to arrange the simple checkers, okay, so that they are compatible with each other.
This is a necessary consequence of Boltzmann's equation.
So it's the equation doesn't say anything. There's nothing in it. It's just a bunch of ambiguous and vague approximations. So not very useful.
S equals k times the natural log of W. If there is no kinetic energy, nothing is moving. So there is only one possible microstate that the particles can inhabit.
So that's what he just said, right? So you're saying that you have a bunch of checkers, 10 checkers, and you're just saying I can pile them on top of each other where they touch each other and I filled all the space. But obviously those 10 checkers could be in any order. I could put numbers on the checkers, and you know that 1 could be over here and 5 could be over there. Electrons and protons are completely interchangeable. They're the same. So it wouldn't matter what order I did it in. So obviously it's not just one arrangement. But whatever, I don't even know why this would be an important detail. These people can't figure out what energy actually is. They can't figure out it doesn't take 25 times the fuel to spin something 5 times as fast. And yet they waste their time doing this.
With a value for W equal to 1, the natural log of 1 is 0. So at absolute zero, the entropy of any substance must also be 0. However, absolute zero can...
The entropy, which is a meaningless word, frankly. It's just meaningless. Energy is always energy. That's never something else. So the psiphicuses in the universe, these things moving, they're either moving freely or they're pushing an electron or proton. There's no other state for them to be in.
Never truly be reached.
They never stop. So if there's low energy somewhere, if there's low, then it has to be high someplace else. Or you have to increase the density of the force someplace else to have reduced density in some other location.
Which is communicated in a rephrasing of the third law, which states that it is impossible to lower the temperature of any system to absolute zero in a finite number of steps.
So again, more bullshit about whether it's the steps you take or any of this other garbage. And it's, again, what's the premise? What makes electrons move? They have no idea, no clue at all. And yet they're making these declarations. So I'm just saying, bullshit.
A satisfactory analysis of this law will require the quantum mechanical zero-point energy and will...
Yeah, the nonsense, okay, the zero-point energy, the universe is making fake universe all the time, or some other kind of horse shit, which isn't happening. So I just can't believe you people fall for this crap. You really think the universe is expanding, that in between every tiny little bit of the universe there's a little poofing of new universe, and everything is moving away from each other without having anything called velocity, when that's pretty much impossible. So if you're poofing universe, you're poofing distance, you're making velocity. But whatever, it's just so ridiculous.
Thus have to wait until the modern physics course.
Yeah, which will be real garbage. But look, it starts here. You can't, if you don't get this elemental stuff right, you're not going to get any of the rest of it right, that's for sure. You start with the wrong premises and axioms, you're dead. And that's what physics has done. It's accepted a bunch of wooey nonsense. Light is a wave, which is bullshit. Energy is somehow mv squared, which is bullshit. So they've gotten all of the elemental functions wrong.
This concludes our analysis of the laws of thermodynamics.
So it's pretty lame and weak analysis, frankly.
A near mythical accomplishment in the history of science. It also means we have covered some of...
So heat is just energy, should be the first thing you understand, and the only thing that really matters. Heat's just motion. That's it. There's nothing else. It's motion in little things. We call that heat. When little things move, we call it heat. That's it. There's nothing here.
The harder stuff in physics. So now we get to move on to fun things like waves and magnets.
Yeah, waves. It's just so ridiculous. It's just, you're just saying, it's such an incoherent, babbly bullshit that there's, it's doing this, and it's doing this, and it's, yeah, right. It's an elemental particle with no brain, and yet it can do all that crap, and then it can be an ESP particle, too. It has all these super functions. God damn.
But first, let's check comprehension.
No, let's not. Okay, so we'll move on to the next pile of shit. Alright, so this is waves, and it's really just, this one's 7 minutes, it's just boring. Well, 6 minutes now. Anyway, I don't know why it said 7. Yeah, it's only 6:20. Anyway, let's just get to it. So he's saying something about we have already examined, who cares? So again, wasted time.
When we looked at Springs and Hooke's law, and the periodic motion that results. Now let's look at another type of vibration that can also result in periodic motion, waves.
So it's just bullshit. We know the waves don't cause anything. Something else is causing the wave. So again, just more nonsense. And again, the wave only is applicable in mediums. So if you want to believe photons are waving, then you have to believe in an ether or some other kind of crap. And they run away from that concept, which is funny. Okay. Because somehow the particles have to be stuck to each other. See, in the atmosphere, they're stuck to each other by the container, the air pressure. So they're forced closer to each other than they want to be, so they have to interact. So if one does something, the rest of them have to do something also because they're too close to each other. All right, and in other substances, it's a chemical bond. Like in water, the molecules are actually literally stuck to each other. So you can have some kind of spreading of energy. But photons aren't stuck to each other.
These should be quite familiar if you've ever been to the beach. But those aren't the only kinds of waves.
And they can be understood for what they are, okay? It's a difficult to compress fluid. You're pushing on the difficult to compress fluid. As you push it, okay, compresses in front of you and it just doesn't want to. And so the pressure gets greater the more you push. And so the pressure has to go this way or it has to go that way. Obviously it can't go down because it can't push into the already pushing back earth. So what does the water do? Oh, it goes up because that's where there's the least pressure. Oh, hardly complicated. And what happens when it goes up? Well, that gravity is going to eventually push it back down when the pressure equalizes or reduces. And so it's just going to keep doing this. Go up, come down, push forward, go up, go down, push forward. That's all it's going to do.
Light and sound can both be considered waves as well. So we will need to learn about the properties of waves. Waves always...
So light doesn't have anything to do with this wave crap. And it can be easily understood because as soon as they do something like this. So this is the single slit experiment, the single opening experiment. Is there any wave interference? Obviously not. The waves just go out, all independent of each other, blah, blah, no interference whatsoever. So single openings do not create any interference in water. Now clearly in photons I'm going to get a huge 70 or 80 fringe bars. So a huge amount of interference. So somehow there's not just one wave. Okay, there's not one source in the photon experiment. There must be two little blippy sources. And the little blippy sources are the surfaces. The single slit is the two surface experiment. The single impediment is the two surface experiment. The double slit is the four surface experiment. Right? You can figure this out, right? You can see that their surfaces 1, 2, 3, 4. Come on. So it has nothing to do with brown waves popping out of openings. It has to do with scatter at the surfaces. Each surface is scattering the photon bits, and merely you're just saying 50% are in phase when they land on the target, and 50% are out of phase when they land on the target. It's that simple. And they've perverted it into this bullshit.
Originate with some event or disturbance, like a pebble falling into a pond, and this disturbance will then propagate outwards from this point.
So the spreading part has nothing to do with fringe patterns, so right? When we're saying a fringe pattern on-off isn't evidence of spreading, quite obviously.
This way, we can consider any wave to be a kind of traveling disturbance that carries energy from place to place.
So we know that it's energy that has been spread, though, over a huge surface. So the energy is dissipated over a huge surface. So if you could take the energy and make a laser beam out of it, it would, do a whole bunch of work. But because it's spread and you can't capture all of the energy, it doesn't do anything. So it's like the difference between light spreading, photons going in all kinds of directions, and you channeling all the photons in one direction. So don't have the illusion that this wave doesn't cost energy. It's a huge amount of energy that you're wasting by spreading it in all these other directions.
Apart from the radial waves on the pond, waves can also be strictly linear, like if you shake a taut rope. In both cases, the wave is traveling through a material medium, so they are called mechanical waves. Mechanical waves can be transverse waves, where the disturbance is perpendicular to the direction the wave is traveling.
So pointing out that somehow it's going up and down, but obviously this illustration has them moving, so again, there's really not showing us just up and down. But anyway.
Traveling, or longitudinal waves, where the disturbance is parallel to the direction the wave is traveling, either by compression or...
And so what you're really just saying is that you're transferring motion between, and that's it. You're just transferring motion from one thing to another thing to another thing to another thing. And you can call that a wave, but there's no obligation that it be in any way made out of a medium, and that the things, it's like dominoes hitting each other. It's kind of cheating to call that waving.
Or rarefaction. With mechanical waves, the medium does not travel with the wave, just the energy is carried by the wave. So in the ocean, the wave will travel a great distance, but any individual water molecule won't go too far. It is only energy that travels along with the...
It doesn't matter whether the water molecules move that way or they move that way. It's still energy. So, that part of it still doesn't make much difference.
The wave. The same can be said for people doing the wave at a stadium. The wave travels, but all of the people stay in their own seats.
And would it matter? So what if instead of going up and down, they just pushed the guy next to them, and he pushed into the next guy like dominoes, and the dominoes automatically reset, so you can constantly just keep pushing them? Well, you could do the same thing, same energy.
However, not all waves are mechanical waves. Some do not require a medium to travel through, like any kind of electromagnetic wave.
Right, so this is the bullshit part. So it's a wave, but it's not a wave. There's no medium, there's no capacity to transfer the energy from one photon to another photon, no mechanism, no theory, and yet we'll say it happens anyway.
Which we know of as light.
And they'll make up something even more preposterous, which is the photon isn't a real thing. It somehow is going to every place in the universe, and it somehow figures out when it's going everywhere that somehow there's only one place it's supposed to land, and so then it just retracts everything it was doing going all these other places and only goes to one place. I mean, this is just goddamn rubbish shit. How the fuck do you people believe that crap? I mean, really, you believe that? You say there's just not possible to come up with a better theory than that shit. Are you kidding?
These waves can travel through the vacuum of space, which is why we are able to see celestial objects in the night sky.
Right, they're rays of photon, okay? That's all. It's energy, bits of force flying through space at the speed of light. It's real stuff with real mass, and it lands on a surface and beats the shit out of it in the sense of it pushes on it.
A wave whose source is a vibration with simple harmonic motion will be a sine wave.
So obviously this again is an interpretation, and you don't have to do this with every single frequency that exists. Doesn't really do this. All right, but obviously most motions are going to have to go, they have to go that way and stop, and then they have to go that way and stop. So obviously they're going to accelerate and decelerate. So yes.
Because the periodic motion of the wave produces a graph of the trigonometric function y equals sine x. We need to label.
But obviously you can make square waves, you can make lots of shape waves by just changing how it accelerates and decelerates and in what time it does that. So again, this whole thing about this sine wave thing is mostly arbitrary.
A few details with sine waves. First, there is the amplitude of the wave. For a transverse wave like this, the amplitude is the displacement of the wave in the direction perpendicular to the direction of its motion, or the distance from the middle to a crest.
So you could say that could be the volume if we were using pellets of rice. I mean, see, you can turn this into anything. If you, no matter what your jello, anything you're moving, you're just saying what's the mass of the jello we're moving, and that's the amplitude. And then you figure out how fast the jello's moving.
Or trough. The greater the amplitude, the more energy the wave carries with it, which is why you shouldn't try to surf 30-foot waves unless you are an expert.
More advice.
In addition, each wave will carry a wavelength, represented by the Greek letter lambda. This is the length of one cycle of the wave.
So again, it's just the length of the period. So it's the period of this event. So it's on, or you could say it's on, on, and you could just, move that zero line, to the bottom, the base of the other thing, and then you could say off, and then it goes back to on again, then it goes back to off.
Which is easily measured from one crest to the next. The time required to complete one cycle is called the period. There will also...
And that's what everything should be understood as, because there's no reason to think every time there's a frequency, it's a wave.
Also be a frequency, which is the number of wavelengths that pass by a particular spot.
I mean, pendulums are not waving.
Per unit time, represented by the Greek letter.
A spinning motor isn't waving. It has a cycle, a period to its oscillating, and no reason to think of it in terms of a wavelength.
Nu. Frequency will typically be measured in hertz, which are inverse seconds, meaning the number of waves that occur per second. We will learn all kinds of math associated with graphing these sine curves in the upcoming mathematics course. For now,
How exciting.
we can just stick to a qualitative discussion. Sound is also brought to our ears through waves, though these are
Yes, that's a legitimate statement. It's a medium and it has a certain compression. And different materials have a different speed of sound, okay, for good reason, because it's a real medium that you're transferring energy through. You have to move the specific atoms that are in the material. And those specific atoms have a different mass ratio, and it requires a different amount of energy to move them.
longitudinal waves. A sound initiates with a vibration, like a plucked string. This vibration requires a medium in which to travel, like a solid, liquid, or gas. Sound can't travel in a vacuum, which is why there is no sound in space, despite what you hear in movies.
There's no ears in space either, so, the fact is that the radiation still exists in space, so there's lots of other ways to hear or see the event.
Typically, sound travels through the air, causing vibrations in atmospheric molecules as it passes, just like a wave in the ocean does to water molecules. Each sound wave will carry a frequency that is equal to the frequency of the vibration that initiated it. The speed
And one of the questions is what kind of thing can initiate sound? Because sound is really breaking the transfer mechanism of the medium. And that's why you're creating sound. So the argument could be made is that all sound are sonic booms. So little things make little tiny sonic booms, big things make big sonic booms when they move faster than the speed of sound. And the fact is, to make a sound, you have to make something move faster than the speed of sound. That's why the tip of the whip, to get the crack, you've got to move the tip of the whip and cause it to accelerate to a speed faster than the speed of sound, because it's all sonic booms. So little hairs on your vocal cords vibrate a little faster than the speed of sound, create little tiny booms, and then the booms are altered in their pitch and tone by, all this other infrastructure.
at which the wave will travel is equal to the wavelength times the frequency, and mechanical waves will travel at a constant speed.
So it's multiplying the thing times the same thing and merely an inverse of the same thing. So it's just such kind of nonsense.
For any given medium, though that speed is different depending on the particular medium. Interestingly, sound travels 4 times faster in water than air, and 17 times faster through steel than.
So the simple argument would be is that obviously the atoms are a lot closer to each other, so the amount of time the little bits have to move, the amount of motion you have to do in the actual medium of the electrons and protons before you hit force instead of matter is less. So it just really has to do with how close the atoms are to each other will increase the speed.
Air. But when we refer to the speed of sound, we typically mean as it moves through the atmosphere, which will be constant since a greater frequency will be accompanied by a smaller wavelength.
So more crap about something that we should care because it's the atmosphere. So obviously the understanding should be is that this is how mediums that are bound, and again the air isn't stuck to the air. The air is being compressed in a vessel, so its association, the air molecules are obviously going to be slower because they're being forced together. They're not being attracted together, where in steel and this other stuff, the fact is the charge is holding them together, the atoms, and keeping the electrons a lot closer to each other.
Let's check comprehension.
Let's not. Alright, should I go with the third video? Yeah, maybe. They're all, like I said, this whole run is a little bit boring. Alright, so this video should be a little better. It's interference and diffraction and refraction, or reflection, yeah. So they're all interesting subjects, but yes, he's going to give them all way too short a shrifty thingy. So not going to be able to make the best out of it. let's just do a tiny bit of it. So the idea of wave interference can be defeated in so many ways, but I mean, they're examples. They're thinking that light has, this is like the double slit experiment. Two waves are creating this pattern, okay, of interference because the waves are intersecting and they're going to create these lines. And it doesn't match. I mean, mathematically it doesn't match. There's no double maxima. Lots of things, features are missing from that explanation actually working. And obviously the idea that it's two waves wouldn't create two patterns. So we know that the pattern has two elements to it. There's dots and then dots and then dots. So you have this double maxima thing here in the center, and then you have these nodes that are half that size going out. And so it has to be explained by something deeper than that. And the simple explanation is that it's just about point sources. 4 point sources will create this pattern. Just understanding that they all have to, where they're all in phase, you get the little dot. And where only 2 of them would be in phase, that would be this, or it would be and that ends up creating the opportunity for this dead spot here. Okay, these little dead spots where neither is producing a photon in that location. Well, no, only one source is. So obviously the point is that this gives you the right dimensions. So you can say that these wide distance, lots of wavelengths, lots of places where you can have in phase and out of phase. And the short distance means only a few places you can have in phase and out of phase. And that really tells the tale. Now the important experiment you can do that just defeats any notion of this being controlled by waves. Well, let me pause and erase because I don't know what I do with the eraser again. Alright, should be back. Alright, so you can do the experiment either, lots of ways you can do this as an experiment. You can use microwaves, do different things, but the fact is you can have 2 sources opposite each other and send the signal to a receiving antenna in between those 2 sources. Okay. And if you do that, okay, you'll end up with the same fringe pattern. So that is, if you move the receiver to these different locations, it'll go on, off, on, off, on, off. So you get the fringe pattern, and the 2 waves obviously can't be interfering with each other. There's no place for the 2 waves to interfere. There's no place where they cross. There's no place where they meet. There's no place where they do any of this nonsense. And so all you're really doing is saying it's an in-phase, out-of-phase argument, and it's just about the number of point sources. And, physics is just, I mean, the mistakes they're making are as obvious as, okay, you could argue the old Deschardelet, let's dent clay with round objects and say that is going to tell us how much real energy objects have. It's like saying, let's point an arrow, and the more we point the arrow, the sharper we make the point, the deeper it penetrates. It means the arrow has more energy. The physics is that bad. And these assholes sell it, And that's... And you people fall for it. Yes. Fool me once, fool me twice. How many times can they fool you with gibberish and nonsense? I mean, you hear all these wacky stories, dark matter, antimatter, neutrino, all kinds of nonsense made up bullshit. And how many times can they fool you? And you just keep believing. Bent space does something. A bent nothing is doing something. I mean, it's so bad. You should be really embarrassed that you've been fooled so many times and you just kept letting them fool you. And then you'll mock Christians, which is just so funny, because you're really just as dumb as. You really are. All right. Let's play the video.
We know a bit about wave mechanics now, so it's time to look at some wave-related phenomena, like what can happen when 2 waves overlap, or when a wave runs into some solid surface. These are very common occurrences, as we are frequently experiencing sound from more than one location at once, and sound will bounce off of walls and other surfaces, so we need to understand what happens to waves in these scenarios.
Do we? No, but yes, if you want to understand physics, you have to understand, yes, this is what mediums will do, okay? The clunky, stuck to each other particles will transfer energy very differently than pool balls, for example.
We know that two solid objects, like two people, can't occupy the same space at the same time.
So why does he even say this when they believe that every electron in the universe can occupy the same space?
But mechanical waves are not matter. They are displacements of matter that carry energy. So two waves can occupy the same space.
So they're really not occupying the same space because obviously they're expanding the space they occupy. So when you combine two waves, you end up with a whole different amount of space that the waves are in. So again, it's just nonsense to say they're occupying the same space. They're not.
And when two waves combine in this way, it is called superposition.
So they're not in an actual superposition because there are physical differences in the condition that exists when the two waves are occupying that space. The volume increases.
There are two disturbances near one another and their respective series of waves overlap. This is called an interference pattern. And we can see how
and it happens in water, okay, with two sources. It doesn't happen in water with one. All right, so just understand that they claim this is the double slit experiment, and it's not. From the light's perspective, this is the single slit experiment, the two source experiment, the two surface experiment.
Regions where the waves intersect generate a completely new pattern.
And understand, water doesn't make a double maxima in the center. I mean, key features are missing, indicating it's not the same fucking thing.
This is easy to see with waves in the water, but sound and light waves also do this.
So light doesn't do it at all. There's no medium. There is no waving, okay? All you're doing is changing the phase, the arrival time of a photon. And changing the arrival time of the bits changes whether you can see it or not see it.
There are a few different things that can happen when interference occurs. Say two individual wave pulses are traveling towards each other, and they have the same amplitude. When these meet, the amplitudes at each point will be added together to produce the respective points on.
Right, so you could just say vol going this way and a vol going that way, and they're going to go, oops, one of them's going to climb over the top of the other one. Yeah, that's simple, really. Now there's twice as much vol in that location. Yeah.
On the resultant wave. So there will be a moment where there is one wave with twice the amplitude. Then the two waves continue in the direction they were moving in. Each wave maintains its own characteristics before and after the interference.
So it's just moving matter, and the matter, obviously you have to conserve the energy, okay, and you're just going to end up with what you put in, you're going to end up with coming back out. So whether you think they bounced off each other, whether you think they went through each other, or you think they missed each other, really doesn't matter because all those outcomes are all going to be the same.
When a resultant wave has greater amplitude than the individual waves, like this case, this is called constructive interference. Now let's say the pulses are on opposite sides of the equilibrium position. Again, according to the superposition principle, we will add the amplitudes to get the resultant wave. But in this case, the two amplitudes add to zero. So the resultant wave will be as though...
So no photons can do this. There's no such thing as a plus photon and a minus photon, and they cancel each other. So it never happens. It's not why there's a pattern in photons. The only reason why there's a pattern in photons is clearly just because of phase. If the little bits aren't at the right frequency, they don't hit the surface at the right frequency, they can't be seen as a photon. So it's just a fact that it's not going to be red light if it's, this much distance, and then this much distance. Say if you need 3 elements to make a photon. So that's another thing to, it shouldn't be that hard for people to realize that photons are events. They aren't a clump, a solid ball of photon. And that, like, say, a radio wave is a gigantic, huge, 10-mile long ball of photon. No, no. It's the time between events, the time of arrival events, okay? And if those arrival events are out of sequence, there won't be a visible photon. There will just be quanta of energy hitting the surface, and you won't see it. Just like you don't see all the other kinds of radiation, radio and microwaves and all that kind of stuff, all invisible to us.
There is no wave at all. Then the waves continue along their trajectories. This kind of interference, where the resultant wave has a smaller amplitude than the individual waves, is called destructive interference. And if the result...
So there's obviously no destructive, in the sense that there really isn't anything not there, okay, in terms of, let's see how to say that. I mean, the energy is still on its courses, and you're just saying at this particular moment you have two pieces, one going one way, one going the opposite way. But a second later, you'll see that they are still oscillating.
The resultant wave has an amplitude of 0, like this example. It is called complete destructive interference. This concept applies to periodic waves as well. First, we can consider...
all waves kind of have to be periodic, don't they? Or are you just saying one wave shows up? Okay.
Two sine waves that are precisely aligned. They are said to be exactly in phase. We can add the amplitude.
So this is the only part that matters in terms of light, is phase. Phase is controlling the experiments.
At every single point, and the result is a similar looking wave with twice the amplitude due to constructive interference, because the crests align with the crests and the troughs.
So if I was shooting bullets, I shoot 4 bullets at the same timing, 1 second apart, and I have 2 guns, and one gun's a half second off. You're going to understand if 2 bullets are going to be deflected from one side and 2 bullets are going to be deflected from the other side, there's a 50-50 chance that when I put them in sequence, I'll have the bullets clumping together, happening at the same time, or happening at exactly the same time away from each other. So the event will be the arrival of 2 bullets at once, and then 2 bullets, or the event will be bang, 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 bang. So just depending on phase will dictate what I end up with hitting the target, just by scatter.
Aligned with the troughs. But then, if we shift one of these by half its wavelength, now the crests
are shifted by a quarter of its wavelength, and then you really have a mess.
Of one align with the troughs of another, and at every single point on the x-axis, these waves will add up to 0. They are said to be exactly out of phase, and this will be an example of complete destructive interference. This is what noise cancellation headphones do. Small microphones detect background.
So this is all correct. You can create the scenario where part of the energy you're putting in is yanging while the other part is yinning, forward versus backward, and you can end up with something that isn't going to be able to impose energy on a surface, your eardrum.
Noise, and process the associated signal, and then reproduce this noise in a way that is precisely out of phase with the signal. The resulting destructive interference results in 0, or at least dramatically reduced sound waves reaching your ears.
Obviously it takes time to do all these calculations, so it's going to be a bit off if there isn't if the noise doesn't have a period to it. Where it happens over and over again, you're probably going to be out of luck.
In reality, interference patterns are often much more complicated than these two extremes, but in every case, the superposition principle is still applicable.
So there's no superposition, antenna here, antenna over here, I move the antenna between the two. There's no superposition. The waves never interact with each other. So really you're just saying, when they hit the surface, there's going to be a timing, the period of the frequency, and that's all there's going to be. And it never interfered.
We also want to understand what happens when waves hit a boundary of some kind. If a boundary is free to move, waves will be reflected, bouncing back in the opposite direction, but maintaining the same amplitude. If instead this boundary is fixed, waves will be both reflected and inverted, bouncing back in the opposite direction, but now with amplitude of the opposite sign. Let's say instead of arriving at a solid boundary, a wave arrives at a boundary with a small gap in it.
So this is just so deceptive, because this is just, he's going to call this diffraction. Diffraction doesn't create a fringe pattern. So this is the single slit drawing essentially, and you're saying, okay, there's nothing in this single slit that could create anything called a fringe pattern. And yet you know the single slit in light has 70 or 80 fringes if you do it with a wide enough opening. Have a wide enough opening and you'll get a whole bunch of fringes, indicating there must be something else happening. Diffraction doesn't explain fringes.
When waves reach an opening like this, they will bend around the edges, producing a phenomenon called diffraction.
And you know why it does that is because of friction with the surface. So you can understand why the waves are bent is because the stuff going against the surface is slowed down. Friction. And clear, easy explanation for why you end up with the stuff in the middle going faster than the stuff going left or right. So obviously that bending thing makes sense. But you know light isn't going to get slowed down. You know none of those things can happen. So why do you think light's popping out of a surface with a little round wave? I mean, it's a ridiculous theory.
A diffraction pattern is another kind of interference pattern.
No, it isn't. So that's just nonsense. There's no interference. It's just a lie to call this any kind of wave interference here. There's no crest meeting a trough. There's none of that crap. So again, why, it's just breaking the word, like saying there's a fourth dimension when the three dimensions have rules, so they have to be 9 degrees to each other. I mean, why don't you just blow the words up? They don't mean anything anymore. If interference means a specific thing, okay, and now you're saying interference just means it's going in a different direction? Bullshit.
Because of the series of maxima and minima that result. And
so none of that happens. There's no maxima and minima with just diffraction. So again, you can't draw it. Show us the pattern here. There's no pattern. So again, it's just absolute bullshit.
Waves of all types will exhibit this behavior.
So nonsense. Mere diffraction will not create fringe patterns.
It was the diffraction of light that provided some of the strangest data we have collected in physics.
So more nonsense. Obviously, it's not the diffraction part. It's the fact that you have one wave intersecting another wave. So again, it's not the diffraction that did it. And as I'm pointing out, clearly none of this is true. You can create the experiment, do the experiment. None of these waves are intersecting. None of them have any possibility of constructively and destructively interfering with each other. So it's all bullshit. This is just a phase argument created, and scatter at the surfaces create the pattern. The double slit pattern, by the way, does not create in photons, does not create this pattern. Obviously, it creates a central maxima, and it creates multiple nodes that diminish in intensity with distance from the center. So it's all just a big fat frickin' lie. This isn't what actually happens. It's not it's not a fair experiment. Okay. It's cheating.
Physics, contributing to the development of quantum theory. But that will have to wait until the modern physics course.
Yeah, and you're not gonna in the modern physics course, you're not gonna explain it mechanically any better. You're just gonna again keep cheating and pretending that we don't see the double maxima, because they have no explanation for it, by the way. Zero. They don't have any explanation for the two patterns superimposed on each other. Zero explanation. They don't even understand that the pattern has to go all the 180 degrees. Yeah, they've never even tested that part of their theory. It really should be an infinite. The waves should be in all directions, so they should be able to detect photons almost going horizontal, parallel to the surface. There should still be photons going there by their theory, and they've never even tested it. Oh, just so disgusting.
For now, let's check comprehension.
Junk science. All right, so fuck this. Just fuck this whole ending part. Support me on Patreon and so I can mislead and pervert little child minds. I mean, obviously this is directed at children. I mean, some of this stuff is so trivial. You can't take this serious. Who are you talking to? Anyway, so till the next time and such. That's enough. So somebody did that. One of these assholes posted another video trying to claim that Newton believed in mv squared. Now, we've been through all this, but I mean, the text is a little bit sloppy the way Newton wrote it. But what we do know is Leibniz sent letters to the king, okay, trying to get Newton shut up. This was when Newton was already, king of the mint. So Newton had moved on. In terms of his job to different other things he was doing. And Leibniz was still bitching. And so Leibniz bitched to the king, and the surrogates, Newton's friends, made counter arguments, and clearly they were arguing, well, they weren't arguing who God was, but they were, 80% of the time, but 20% of the time they were arguing momentum versus kinetic energy. All right. And then 40 years later, in 1735, let's just say, de Châtelet made a whole big stink out of this controversy when she was doing her translation of Newton. And there was clearly two camps, Leibniz and Newton. And they were clearly in direct contradiction. And it was called the vis viva controversy, and it lasted for 100 fucking years. So how can you make this argument that Newton was a Leibnizian when clearly there wouldn't be a 100-year argument? The French even sponsored a contest to prove the case one way or another, but nobody could do it. They didn't succeed in doing it, let's just say. But it's just nonsense to say Newton was a Leibnizian when clearly they were arguing it for 100 years. The difference between the two theories, you fuckers. I mean, it's just people are just so dishonest. So I'm not going to argue it. You just don't give a shit about the actual physical real history. You haven't read any of it. You don't understand any of it. And so you just talk shit. So yeah, fuck you. I'm not going to waste my time doing that. Produce the fucking evidence. Just show it taking 25 times the fuel to spin a motor 5 times as fast. Just show the fucking evidence and the argument's over. But you can't show the evidence because it doesn't fucking happen. You scummy liars. I can't believe for 5 years I have to argue this shit. You actually believe it takes 25 times the fuel. You think the 8-pound bowling ball will knock down more pins. Those are the conclusions you have to draw. If you're going to say it's energy, it has to be able to do work somewhere, you fucker. So why don't you just show me the experiment where it actually does some fucking goddamn work? It obviously can't do any work on a ballistic pendulum. Where can it do some work? Why don't you show me it ringing a bell somewhere? You fuckers. Show me the car crash. Show me the tug of war. Show me one piece of fucking evidence demonstrating this stupid, idiotic, moronic crap is true. Alright. But you can't do it. That's the fucking only fact that matters. So explain why you can't produce evidence of something this obvious. The 5 mass going 10 has twice the energy of the 10 mass going 5. Well, show it. Or shut the fuck up.